And we have a whole set of violence specialists that we employ in order to do that. So I'm going to give a pretty big sweep today. First, war. I'm going to talk about, I only assigned about 10 pages of Thucydides, of a pretty long and detailed book, which is worth reading. It's up there with one of the classics. It's one of those books that you should have read before you graduate from university. So I gave you a kind of a, Germans call it a Vorspeise, a taste of Thucydides. War is normally thought of as state on state. And when you think of the state, you need two organizations that monopolize violence within their given territory, and then they make war on each other. And that's the way we normally study war. We take states, and we kind of turn them into these billiard balls, and we study the clash of these billiard balls against each other. We don't look at what goes on inside of the billiard ball. So there's the classic Weberian definition of a state. Monopoly of legitimate use of violence within a given territory. But civil war, it's something different. Because there what you have is a situation in which the state sovereignty has pretty much collapsed. Or at a minimum, it's deeply challenged. Anybody who's in Syria today can tell you that there is the state, but the state certainly does not enjoy a monopoly of the use of force within that territory. In essence, you have the collapse of sovereignty. Or you could have multiple sovereignties, which is arguably the case in Syria today as well, too. As soon as the rebels come into a certain area, they set up a set of governing structures that in effect compete with these existing state governing structures. It is an interesting question to ask, what's the difference between a civil war and a revolution? Part of it is, of course, the sequence. We tend to say things are revolutions once we've already seen the outcome. It could be that what's happening, the rebels in Syria view themselves as revolutionaries. They're making a revolution against what they view as a hated, evil, and corrupt regime. Well, we don't know who's going to win that one. It could be that the Assad regime wins, in which case there's no revolution, there's been a civil war. It can also be that the outcome of the civil war is non-revolutionary. That is, there's no really big changes that happen. And the other thing that I want to talk about in today's lecture is the difficulty that we have making sense of neighbor-on-neighbor violence. If you look at many of the worst cases of violence in human history, genocides, they tend to involve a lot of violence which is intimate, if you will, in which people know the people who are going to kill them. They may not know them well, but they can identify them sometimes by name, sometimes by social function. That was the school teacher, that was the police captain, that was a doctor, that was a farmer who sold me stuff, that was my next door neighbor. It's very difficult to make sense of it, and I wanted to try to make sense of that too. So, let's proceed. Ancient Greece. There we have a map of Greece. The area that we're talking about in the Peloponnesian War is here. Way up at the top, at the northwest part of Greece, the island of Corfu, what is today Corfu, we know as Corfu. A lot of students your age go there and make fools of themselves every summer. I myself rented a motorcycle there when I was 17 years old. It is a great place to go. There's a very nice boat, an overnight boat that takes you from Brindisi in Italy in the south to Corfu that the captain lets you sleep on the roof of the boat. Lots of people running around without any clothes on. Corfu. So it just happens to be the place that a lot of students have visited. So we have the Peloponnesian War, which takes place in Greece from 431 to 403 BCE. (431 to 403), so the time goes backwards before the Common Era. And you have this kind of, I'll give you a little bit of the backstory. Even before that, of course, the Greeks beat back the Persians. The Athenians lead the way, almost single-handedly, in this kind of group of little city-states called the Delian League. And Athens, in the ensuing period, becomes very strong. You had a kind of balance of power between the various city-states of Greece, and the Athenians become very strong. For a whole host of reasons we don't have time to get into here. There were significant contrasts between the Athenians and the Spartans. The Spartans were a land empire. The Athenians were a trading and maritime. The Spartans tended to be, well, not tended to be, were clearly oligarchic, even dictatorial, versus this Athenian democracy that we've already talked about in this class when we talked about Constant. You'll remember. Remember that guy Constant that you just kind of wrote papers on? So you had, and of course, most importantly, the Spartans, as in meet the Spartans, right? The Spartans were very military-oriented. They were martial. They had kind of professional soldier armies. Whereas in the case of Greece, while you did have, of course, some professional soldier armies, you also had citizen soldiers. Both had slaves. There was slavery everywhere in ancient Greece. Forget about Pericles. I know I'm going to skip over Pericles. I mean, everybody who studies ancient Greece and why are you skipping over Pericles? Pericles was the kind of the model of the great democratic leader, the great democratic orator. He could both. He was considered not a tyrant, but a leader who could lead through inspiration and persuasion, kind of the Barack Obama of ancient Greece. Why was there war? Well, what Thucydides tells us, there was a rise of power in Athens and the alarm it caused in Sparta and its allies. That's almost a quote. There is the quote. The Athenians might become too powerful, seeing the greater part of Greece was already in their hands. I think the truest cause, but the least spoken cause, was the growth of Athenian power, which presented an object of fear to the Spartans and forced them to go to war. In essence, it's an early balance of power theory of war. Thucydides was, even before that whole idea of balance of power was even discussed, Thucydides was already, in essence, had adopted it. You don't have to remember all this stuff. This is all background. I'm giving you background. You don't even need good notes here. I'm not going to ask you a question on a test about it. Could I be any clearer? Sit back, relax, and enjoy. And I'll tell you when you need to engage. How about that? So you have the war, and the reasons that Thucydides tells you. Worried that they might become too powerful. Here, I'm already repeating myself. Forget about this. Look at the bottom point. The motives. If you've read your Stephen Pinker, you'll notice that those motives are pretty much exactly the same that he talks about the motives for violence. Fear, honor, and interest. Sparta gets involved in this war because all its other allies are worried that if they don't all get together, they're going to be in big trouble. The Athenians are going to dominate everybody. So here we have Corfu. Corfu itself is divided between a pro-Spartan and a pro-Athenian orientation, between oligarchs and democrats, each with their own external factors for people off the island. Now is when you might want to pay attention. So Thucydides says, now in time of peace, they could have had no pretext and would not have been so eager to call them in. But because this was war, and allies were to be had for either party to hurt their enemies and strengthen themselves at the same time, invitations to intervene came readily from those who wanted a new government. One of the great themes here. So this is a war. It's 2,500 years ago. The Civil War of 2,500 years ago. And you ask yourself about Syria today, with the Assad regime seeking the backing of Iran and Russia, and the rebels seeking the backing of, well, pretty much everybody else. That's what we're talking about. The themes remain largely the same. Especially in smaller states, divided sides will seek backing of outsiders. You don't have to take that whole quote. You have that quote and you read it. It's there. All you have to do is underline it. Okay? Repeat why. Well, one of the most interesting themes is really in this reading that I gave you is his understanding of what happens in violence during times of civil war. Again, this is in your reading, that quote. In some ways, the parable of civil war, the theme of civil war, goes all the way back. It's biblical. It even goes back before this. Of course, the Greeks didn't know the Hebrew Bible, but the story of Cain and Abel, brother on brother violence. And as we know, anybody who's ever been in a family knows that family violence is sometimes the worst kind of violence. Family arguments are the worst kinds of arguments. And so you have, on a very small island with small population, he says, every form of death was seen at this time. And there was nothing people would not do and more. Fathers killed their sons. Men were dragged out of temples and then killed hard by. And some who were walled up in the temple of Dionysus died inside of it. Indeed, the holy places were violated. Taboos are broken. Father killing son. There's something about civil war that drags people down. Thucydides tries to get at this. And he says, civil war brought many hardships to the cities, such as happened and will always happen as long as human nature is the same. Although they may be more or less violent, they may be more or less violent or take different forms, depending on circumstances in each case. In peace and prosperities, cities and private individuals are better minded because they are not plunged into the necessity of doing anything against their will. But war is a violent teacher. It gives most people impulses that are as bad as their situation when it takes away easy supply of what they need for daily life. That's kind of telling us that the veneer of civilization is a very thin one. And that human nature is such that there may be a human nature. We may be people with given natures. But all you have to do is change the circumstances in which we live and the restraint with which we normally believe that we act towards each other. I may like you, not like you. You may not like me. but we act as if we like each other, or as if we respect each other. And what Thucydides is telling us is that kind of basic minimal respect for human life, that can go away very quickly once the hardships of war are upon us. Because war, as he says, is a violent teacher. And it releases, we all have within us these impulses, Thucydides is saying. This is pretty complex stuff for back then. As a matter of fact, in the understanding civil wars, I'm not sure we've gone beyond this statement here. This may be as good as it gets. I'm going to try to do better, and I think Pinker also tries to do better, but this is pretty good. You change people's circumstances, they act very differently. The other thing that Thucydides really points us to is what happens with language. War does something with language. It alters language. Why does this matter? I'm going to make a radical argument here. I'm going to make a really radical argument. And you're not going to agree with me. But you may agree with me 6 months from now. You are incapable of thinking except in terms of language. You think in language. That seems to be pretty vague. Let me put it to you more directly. If you can't say it to me, the thought doesn't exist. You don't have it. It's not there. You have a feeling, maybe. A feeling. You don't have a thought. Thoughts and feelings are different things. I love you so much I can't express it. Of course, the response is, well, try. But there's a reason you can't express it. The expression, because what you're having, what you're experiencing is a feeling. Feelings are important. They're very important. But if you can't say it, you don't have a thought. That's why we have you write papers. You may think you have a thought. You've actually sat down and said, yeah, I got this paper down pat, man. I'm just going to wait till tonight to do it. Break open the bottle of scotch, sit at the computer, and write the paper. And then you sit down, you try to write the paper, and it's harder than you thought. So all of a sudden, the thoughts, the words aren't there. And I put it to you because the thoughts aren't there. I have no access to your mind beyond your use of language. Indeed, you have no access to your mind apart from the use of language. Anybody ever read George Orwell's 1984? They have the Newspeak Dictionary. What is the object of the Newspeak Dictionary? This is an anti-utopian future in which there's a big brother who controls everything. What?
The destruction of words.
Why are they destroying the words? Why is it easier to control people?
You can't express yourself.
No. Put together what I just put before.
Give them thoughts.
What? Thought control, and you can't express it, you can't think it. They're not interested in not having you say stuff. Anybody can do that. You simply have to have, Kim Jong-il can do that. Get people to stop saying things. They want you to stop thinking things. Thought control. Not expression control. Expression control I can do. Anybody who says a certain word in here, I fail. I have expression control. I can't stop you from thinking the word. Of course, if I said that, thinking the word, my sons would say, of course, which is the word? The bird is the word. No one's allowed to say that in my family, or immediately gets pointed out. Okay. Thucydides says, and they reversed the usual way of using words to evaluate activities. Ill-considered boldness was counted as loyal manliness. Prudent hesitation was held to be cowardice in disguise. and moderation merely the cloak of an unmanly creature nature. A mind that could grasp the good of the whole was considered wholly lazy. It's really brilliant, because anybody who's ever seen debates before wars knows that this is exactly what happens. Should we wait before we go bomb? What are you, chicken? No, I'm prudent. Who's to say? War alters the meaning of language. But even more important, of course, is it alters our ability to think. It may be, even in that sense, if our thought process, our reasoning process, that is, our rationality, it may even make us irrational. Thucydides isn't saying war is bad. He's not a peace activist. He's simply trying to get into the human psychology of war, of violence. That's in your reading too, by the way. I'm just taking nice quotes. And of course, there's no room for the statesman, for the prudent leader. Then he says, he has another quote which makes exactly the same point. Most of these acted from a passionate desire for their neighbor's possessions, but there were also those who attacked the wealthy for not their own gain, but primarily for equality. And they were the most carried away by their undisciplined anger to commit savage and pitiless acts. That is, it's not people who just wanted to steal your junk. It's people who didn't like you because they didn't like you. They felt dissed by you in one way or another. Now that life had been thrown into confusion in the city, human nature, which is accustomed to violate justice and the laws, came to dominate law altogether, and showed itself with delight to be the slave of anger, the master of justice. Human nature became the master of justice. Human nature, which is kind of unbridled passion, and the enemy of anyone's superior. Without the destructive force of envy, you see, people would not value revenge over piety, or profits over justice. When they want revenge on others, people are determined first to destroy without a trace the laws that commonly govern such matters. Again, he speaks to the very thin veneer of civilization that allows our worst instincts to be acted upon during times of civil war. It's worth pondering our own situation here in Canada. We tend to think that our civility is deeply ingrained. That may be the dominant Canadian trait. It may be the Canadian trait by which they define themselves against Americans, for example, even more so than nationalized health care. Canadian civility, Canadian restraint, Canadian goodness, justice, peace. What Thucydides is telling us is that under the right circumstances, what appears to be an innate part of the national character fades away. And so he raises this contradiction between what the Greeks call physis versus nomos, that is, human nature versus law or convention. There is nature on the one hand and convention on the other. Or law. They didn't really make that distinction like we do. Nature is violent, law is orderly. Nature is full of greed and envy. Law is hierarchical, peaceful. The Greeks and Thucydides, he was not a social scientist. He doesn't have a clear set of propositions by which what causes what. He he's often seen as the first historian of Thucydides, in that he really does give you a narrative. I mean, if you read the book, The Peloponnesian Wars, the history of the Peloponnesian Wars, it's blow-by-blow battles. But it's not just that. And it's not only that, and perhaps in some ways it's not even that, because there's very little evidence that Thucydides was actually at many of these things. He couldn't have been everywhere all at once. He got reports, and he wrote this all up, but he was obviously trying to make a series of broader points. And this series of broader points is something about the relationship of human nature to the conditions of peace. There's a famous part of Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, when the Greeks actually decide to invade Sicily. And I talked about this earlier in the course. This was Alcibiades. Actually, we have no idea how to pronounce Greek correctly. That's part of our problem. There is no kind of, it's not like Latin where there's a received way of pronouncing it. So Alcibiades, who was after one of the leaders after Pericles, he comes up and says, look, we can go kick butt in Sicily really easily. This is going to be a lot of fun. They're going to welcome us. It's going to be wonderful. He was the kind of ancient Greek Dick Cheney. It's going to be easy. I can't walk, I believe, was the Republican expression for the Iraq War. And they went and invaded. And of course, they lose terribly. They invade and they lose. And Thucydides, it's not so much important that Thucydides tells us this, although it's important that Thucydides tells us this. We would have had no other record of it otherwise, of the Greek invasion of Sicily. But it's the morals that he draws from the story, like the ones I'm showing you. He says, oh, the reason they failed is because their ambitions outran their interests. It's a wonderful phrase. Their ambitions outran their interests. They didn't need to do that. They didn't need to invade Sicily. They could have gotten by just as easily. It was not necessarily in their interest. So it's not necessarily wrong to go to war. Thucydides may be telling us it's wrong to go to war when it doesn't really serve your interest. When it's out of greed or overreaching. Okay. So much for Thucydides. Any questions? Yeah. Would collateral damage be a modern version of, would collateral damage be a modern version of what? Yeah, would collateral damage be the modern equivalent of the introduction of new language? You don't want to talk about civilian deaths, for example, which is the real description of collateral damage. Collateral damage doesn't express anything. Right? Yes. So a whole language is invented in order to describe war, in order to make it more palatable to the human psyche. So we call it the Department of Defense. We don't call it the Department of Offense. Right? It used to be called the War Department, I should add, right, in the United States. It was called the War Department. And that was, you know, World War II was called the War Department. It gets changed. More questions? Yeah.
Argument that stability is medium grade and Canadian and not argument have there been examples of circumstances where that their circumstances have collaborated? Have there been examples of
Yes. Have there been examples in Canada? I talked about the Canadian civility as being, we tend to view as being inherent to Canadian culture and nature. It's who we are. Have there been examples under which that civility has kind of gone away, you're asking, and have led to bad stuff? Yes. 1933, the corner of Christie and Bloor. Christie and Bloor, right? Half a kilometer from here.